Hello, it's Scott Manley here. It's the 23rd of August and it's time for some more deep space updates, and boy, do we have a lot going on. But of course, we rewind to August 8th when we had a Starlink launch out of Vandenberg carrying 15 Starlink V2 satellites into their 43-degree orbit. This was actually visible from my house. I got some snapshots of it, and for bonus points, I went over to the neighbours and we had like a Starlink pass like straight after. It blew my mind. 8th of August, we also had China launching a Long March 2C carrying a satellite called SR-02 or Huangjing. This went to sun-synchronous orbit. I presume it's a synthetic aperture radar satellite performing Earth observation. 10th of August was also a Chinese launch from Galactic Energy with their Series 1 rocket. This mission was designated Lucky 7. They carried multiple satellites, with the primary payload being a spacecraft called Diwang, Xianyang Yingli 1, which is a tech demonstrator, and then there was some small Earth observation satellites, Jianghang 2, Ziguang 1 and Jingji 1B. I don't know what any of these things do, but they are apparently Earth observation satellites in sun-synchronous orbits. And then on the 10th of August, we also had a Soyuz 2.1B with a Fregat ferry stage and, of course, the Luna 5 spacecraft on top, carrying Russia's hopes of demonstrating that they are, in fact, capable of doing more than launching stuff to low Earth orbit. And as you've probably heard by now, it did actually succeed in getting all the way to the moon, but did not, in fact, land safely. It did beat India, though, technically. Anyway, on the 11th of August, there was a Falcon 9 carrying another group of Starlink Group 6, 22, of course, because it was the East Coast, flying out of Cape Canaveral. 12th of August, there was a Long March 3B/E carrying a very interesting spacecraft known as Luditans 4. Now, this is a synthetic aperture radar satellite in geostationary orbit. So, SAR satellites, they use radar to, image the Earth, and they use the fact that the spacecraft is moving across the surface to create a synthetic aperture, hence the term synthetic aperture radar. Now, this spacecraft sits in geostationary orbit and it's inclined at an angle of about 16 degrees. So it actually sort of makes this sort of figure 8 pattern over 24 hours, but it more or less hangs out in the same part of the orbit. And that means that they can do low resolution synthetic aperture radar of the area underneath the satellite for, and with revisits guaranteed every 24 hours. So it's an interesting piece of hardware there. 14th of August was also a Chinese launch of Kuaizhou 1A by, of course, X-Pace, carrying four satellites, I believe. Yangtong 6 to 10, sorry, it's 4 to 5 satellites, or Head 3A, 3E. Went to low Earth orbit. Also was basically carrying hardware. These satellites apparently performed marine tracking applications. 17th of August was another Starlink launch, Group 6, 43-degree orbit from Cape Canaveral. And 20th of August, a few days ago, Long March 4C from Jiuquan, carrying the Gaofen 1204 Earth observation satellite into sun-synchronous orbit. And 22nd of August, from Vandenberg, we had the first Starlink Group 7 launch from Vandenberg. And this is an interesting one because this launch went to a 53-degree orbit. The previous Vandenberg launch that I mentioned, it went to a 43-degree orbit, and that means that it had to head south and then perform a dogleg maneuver. But this doesn't need the dogleg, and they were able to launch 21 satellites as opposed to 15 into this 53-degree orbit. And it sounds like SpaceX are going to start launching their Group 7 satellites primarily from Vandenberg and keep the Group 6 on the East Coast where they have lower inclinations and they don't have to pay such a penalty. Okay, so also on the 23rd of August, there was a Soyuz carrying Progress MS-24 from Baikonur to the International Space Station. Basically space station logistics, cargo, propellant, supplies, other consumables. And About a few hours ago, Rocket Lab launched an Electron from Mahia with the title We Love the Nightlife. This is a launch for Capella Space, the San Francisco-based synthetic aperture radar company. This is the Acadia, a new generation of their satellites, codenamed Acadia. They have a larger radio bandwidth. I believe it's like goes from 500 megahertz now up to 700 megahertz. And that lets them perform higher resolution scanning at faster rates because they've just got more data in this bandwidth. It's also interesting, this is supposed to be part of a constellation, and these satellites will apparently have laser interconnects to relay data between them so that they can downlink the data faster with fewer ground stations. But on the Rocket Lab side of things, this was interesting because this was a reusable launch. It was their 40th launch, had a little red band on it, and they did indeed recover the spacecraft. But it was also pointed out that this was the 399th engine they had launched into space. Why 399? Why is that interesting? Because the Rocket Lab's Electron uses 10 engines, 9 in the first stage, 1 in the second. They were reusing 1 engine in the first stage, and according to all the data, it performed as expected. They did actually release footage showing it performing a static fire test in a test cell. So this is just bodes well for Rocket Lab and their reusability. Also, in the last 24 hours, North Korea made another attempt to launch a satellite and failed. And yes, so we come back to Luna 25. Yes, it failed, as you might have heard. Luna 25 was supposed to be going to the South Pole, and because it took a more direct route, because it had a more performant in-space stage, it got to the moon before India, and then on one of the final maneuvers to bring it down to just like 18 kilometers above the surface, where it could actually begin its landing procedure, the engine appears to have fired for too long and dropped the perigee or the perilune of the spacecraft inside the moon, whereupon it crashed. And they have identified the location of the crash, and by the looks of things, the Lunar Reconnaissance Orbiter will be passing over that location, I think, in the next 24 hours, probably by the time you've seen this. So it's a good chance we might actually get to see the mess that this thing made, because it did actually hit at essentially orbital velocity, so it might make a bigger bang, a bigger splat than some of the other spacecraft that crashed more slowly. Of course, flip side of this is that Chandrayaan-3, or the Vikram lander specifically, landed on the moon. Congratulations, eyes roll. Yes, that is fabulous to see. This makes India the 4th country to successfully take a domestic spacecraft and land it softly on the surface of the moon. This obviously is a repeat of the attempt that was going to happen with Chandrayaan-2, and it was really good to see this excitement in mission control. Of course, everyone applauding. Now, since we've seen the landing, we haven't had much more data. We've certainly seen a few images. We have heard that the rover has made it successfully to the surface, but I'm presuming that in next couple of days we're actually going to see a lot more data. We're going to really pin down where it actually landed. Of course, amateur spacecraft watchers have a pretty good idea of where Chandrayaan-3's lander actually is, but we will get this confirmed. And of course, Lunar Reconnaissance Orbiter will be flying over that site in a few days as well. So again, pay attention, we might see some images from orbit. Now, another lunar lander which is yet to fly is Intuitive Machines spacecraft, and they have finally set a mid-November launch date for their first lunar lander. This is going to be the first spacecraft under NASA's CLPS, Commercial Lunar Payload Services program, which is, NASA's basically paying providers to land experiments on the lunar surface. So their IM-1 lunar lander mission is supposed to launch on a Falcon 9. It has a 6-day window in November. It's beginning November 15th, launching from the East Coast, from Cape Canaveral. It will be windows, of course, in December if there's any problems. But yeah, we could be seeing another lander headed to the moon before the end of the year. Also, The lunar flashlight, if you remember, finally got a failure report on that, and that was, of course, one of the small CubeSats that rode along with Artemis 1. And it wasn't just like a small, university CubeSat. This was like a fairly important production. This was supposed to use high intensity lasers to illuminate the interior of craters so that they could actually see if they contained any material that was like a liquid. So what the report found was that the engine stopped performing, and this has been blamed on debris in the fuel system, which started clogging up systems. At one point, they had one engine working, and they were able to operate that by rotating the satellite to stabilize it and firing just that one engine. But eventually that failed. There was another engine that was operating at 1/4 power. They ran with that for a while, but that eventually clogged up too. So it's thought that significant parts of the spacecraft's propulsion system were 3D printed from laser sintered titanium, and there was no filters or whatever put in place. This satellite was kind of put together quickly. And here's the thing about CubeSats. They're great for universities to get their sort of feet wet with satellite building and put together a satellite that isn't a massive project and, possibly get it into orbit for low cost. And we've seen NASA and more professional spacecraft builders knowing that they can build some cool stuff in these form factors. But when you're doing these kind of high-risk missions, you really want to make sure you still treat it like a big mission. You do all the testing. And I think this is what we had here, that, there was some assumptions that this would have been easier than it actually was. Anyway, hopefully that we perhaps see some follow-up on that. Also in the last week, by the way, or last couple of weeks, we had Virgin Galactic making their first proper tourist flight to 88.5 kilometers, carrying 3 passengers. First of all, paying passenger John Goodwin, who's 80 years old. He was an Olympic athlete and an explorer. But the other 2 passengers were the winner of a competition for the Space for Humanity Foundation or whatever. So that was Keisha Shahaf, and she brought along her guest, her daughter, Anastasia Myers. They're from Antigua and Barbuda, and I don't know, it was really quite fun to watch them be genuinely excited. And yes, I think this is the first dreadlocks in space, and I do love the fact that Anastasia got to keep in all her piercings for spaceflight, because that is something I've not seen up until this point. It reminded me more of like belter culture from The Expanse, and I hope that we see a lot more of that in space, to be honest. So SpaceX have also announced that they are going to be performing a new set of missions called Bandwagon. So Bandwagon is a bit like their transporter missions, or it's a new version of their transporter missions, which is going to go to lower inclination orbits. Transporter goes to 97 degree sun synchronous orbits. I think we're going to be seeing 45 degree orbits in the 500 kilometer altitude range. And there's a lot of demand for this, and SpaceX is rising for that demand. Amazon, who have had their Kuiper spacecraft, originally they were going to launch the first pair of Kuiper spacecraft on ABL Space Systems RS-1. That, of course, had a failure and is back on the drawing board at this point. That then got transferred to Vulcan, and they were going to be a rideshare payload with the first the Peregrine lunar lander. And of course, that is currently being delayed because of problems with the second stage. So they're deciding to actually dedicate an Atlas V to launch their 2 test satellites. And interestingly, this will be an Atlas 501. That means it's got the 5-meter fairing, which is kind of rare. In fact, I think there was only one other case. The 0 means that there's no strap-on rocket motors, but they need the big fairing, I guess, because the satellites need to be able to fit into these large areas. So, that should actually launch like next month. So we should see an Atlas V very soon. That, of course, obviously has to affect their strategy, since there is only a limited number of Atlas Vs still available. NOAA, the National Oceanographic and Atlas something or other. Right, they have made news in the last couple of weeks by reducing limits on remote sensing licensing. So they are responsible for licensing all these private organizations who are performing Earth sensing and say publishing satellite images at, quarter meter resolution. So they have just loosened the rules now, and Umbra have immediately come forward with a 0.16 millimeter synthetic aperture radar imagery. So that's half a foot, 6 inches, or 16 centimeters. Yet prior to this, the rule was that if a US supplier wanted to offer a service, they had to have a foreign competitor already providing that capability somewhere else in the world. So yeah, NOAA's loosening things up. We're going to see new capabilities going forwards. Also, Umbra has signed a deal with has got money from the Air Force, like it's a small amount, like a couple of $1 million, for a grant to start detecting moving objects within its synthetic radar data. That's going to be, I guess, an interesting capability that the US Department of Defense is very interested in. The National Reconnaissance Orbit, by the way, is also looking for new suppliers for satellite imagery, like new and interesting things. They're also looking for non-Earth imaging capabilities. So one of the things that NOAA had in place was that you weren't allowed to image other spacecraft without the permission of their owners. So I remember speaking to someone from Planet, I think it was, and they told me, oh yeah, if we accidentally image the space station, they have to basically not release that image because you're not supposed to image the space station without getting asked. Sounds like that limitation is being relaxed somewhat, and of course the NRO is very interested in capitalizing on that. Bigger deals are Ball Aerospace, which is being bought for $5.5 billion by BAE, which is a US side of the British defense contractor. So Ball Aerospace, they're like in Colorado, they're a manufacturer, they've built a lot of spacecraft. They've been building spacecraft for a very long time, and yes, they have the same logo as the Ball mason jars, or the Ball. You might find cans of beer in the US with the Ball logo on it. So this is one of the biggest defense deals in space in the last year. I mean, it's telling that it's way bigger than what Aerojet Rocketdyne sold for. Ball have been doing a lot of work on satellite hardware. Okay, Axiom. Axiom have signed a deal with Poland to fly a Polish astronaut to the International Space Station. And by the way, this also happened as Axiom got $350 million of investment from Saudi and Korea investors. So yeah, we don't have an official name for this Polish astronaut which is going to fly to the ISS, but the best candidate is a guy called Sławoj Uznianski, right? So he was selected as a reserve astronaut by the European Space Agency last November. And so he's the only Polish member of ESA's astronaut corps, even though he's not actually eligible to fly on an ESA mission. So Poland paying to fly him separately would actually fit in with this. I mean, we've also seen another ESA reserve astronaut, Marcus Wandt of Sweden. He's being booked to fly on Axiom 3. Okay, European Space Agency also had an interesting mission called ClearSpace 1, which was built by a Swiss contractor. It was going to essentially demonstrate the ability to remove orbital debris. And specifically, it was supposed to remove an interstage from a Vega launch vehicle that had been sitting in orbit for some time. And unfortunately, it just got hit by some space debris. And there's now a few different pieces floating around. So they may have to come up with a different target for that mission, depending on what the status of this object is. Or maybe it breaks into enough pieces that it's now deorbiting. Over in Boca Chica, well, Starship booster, it has got its hot staging system. We got some nice photographs showing the open sides for the grill with the shielding over the top, and we saw underneath as well, there's a lot of bracing under there to handle the thrust of the stage separation. Now, we don't know when this is going to fly yet, but we have started seeing marine warnings, like closures of certain areas of the sea. Starting, originally it was August 31st. I didn't think that was going to happen. Currently they're up to like September 8th. So They are definitely thinking about launching in the next few weeks, but there's a lot of stuff that needs to happen. They obviously need to go through the tests and the integration and all the pre-flight tests, but they also have to have a launch license get issued. And for that, the FAA is going to have to be happy with the failure report and the various things that SpaceX are doing to deal with the issues. Specifically, the debris that was thrown out. Well, we've already seen the giant booster B-Day working, but also the fact that the flight termination system didn't really terminate the flight until way later, until it had lost a lot of the pressure. So FAA is definitely going to be one of the things to watch for this launch, but it could happen, in September. It could happen in coming weeks. It could happen before the next one of these deep space thingies. Anyway, one thing that won't happen is SLS launching, because SLS, of course, takes forever and costs too much. That's why NASA Office of Inspector General is going to investigate the procurement for SLS Block 1B, and I fully expect that the OIG is going to find all sorts of problems with cost overruns, schedule overruns, contractors not performing as expected, and a vehicle that doesn't really have much in the way of utility. And I fully expect Congress to look hard at all this, say a number of things, and not actually do anything to change what's going on. Also, Bill Nelson just tweeted out today about visiting the Blue Origin factory, and frankly, that isn't that interesting, except that they included a number of photos showing New Glenn boosters that look like production articles actually in the factory and, pretty close to being built. So we are actually seeing that Blue Origin has full-size New Glenn hardware floating around. And that does actually bode well for their attempts to finally perhaps get this launched in the next couple of years. I don't know. Anyway, that is my list of deep space updates. Watch for the next SpaceX Crew launch, Crew 7, coming in the coming days. Congratulations once again to the Indian Space Agency and everybody that helped you become the 4th nation to put a spacecraft softly on the surface of the moon. I'm Scott Manley. Fly safe.